Hello everyone, my name is Dr. Yonit Arthur. I'm an audiologist and strength coach, and I specialize in vestibular disorders. Welcome to my channel, The Steady Coach. Today we're going to be talking about part 2 of a 2-part series in which we discuss how to handle your daily routine with chronic dizziness symptoms. In part 1, we talked about the first part of your day. We talked about dealing with things like work if you're still working. We talked about driving. And in this part, we're going to be talking about some of the things you might be doing generally in the afternoons, such as going grocery shopping, your nighttime routine, and cooking, cleaning, and doing chores. So let's get started with supermarkets. So what you may have heard me talk about in that last video and emphasize is that it's really important to determine if we have some kind of emotional response that we're not aware of to the situation that seems to be causing our symptoms to go up. For example, we talked about how if your symptoms are worse in the morning, sometimes that's not really just stress. It can also be a reaction to other things you're doing in the morning that are provoking or causing some emotional responses or conflicts. But when it comes to supermarkets, so very many of my clients have difficulty with this particular task that I don't believe that you should be spending a whole lot of time trying to figure out what about the supermarket might be bothering you on a deep emotional level. Supermarkets are just tough when you have a vestibular disorder. So to remind you, when your brain is trying to figure out how to balance, it's using information from your eyes, your ears, and your sense of touch. When you have a vestibular disorder, which neural circuit dizziness falls roughly into the category of, your brain may choose to overemphasize or overuse your eyes rather than using information from your ears or your sense of touch. What this means is that when you go into a place like a supermarket where your eyes are getting an absolute bombardment of visual stimuli, so visual things to look at, it may just be overwhelming your eyes. And when your eyes are overwhelmed and your brain's not pulling back from using your eyes, in other words, when it's not doing a good job of filtering out the information that's coming from your eyes and relying on your ears or your sense of touch instead, you're going to feel dizzy. Now, we talked in the first part as well about what can sometimes be causing some of these physical symptoms. We talked about how the threat response, when your body is under threat, it changes the blood supply to various organs in your body, and it causes your brain to pay more attention to some things and less attention to other things, all for the purpose of survival. So if this is your brain's threat mode kicking on, supermarkets are just going to be very challenging situations. The visual stimuli that we just talked about, and also the walking. Walking is also a very difficult vestibular exercise, and you're also doing a lot of head turning and bending over when you're grocery shopping as well. So it's really actually kind of the ideal vestibular exercise if you think about vestibular therapy. But let's talk about some ways to help you deal with this particular situation. So first and foremost, I can't tell you any of this advice without, of course, emphasizing that the way you really get better from neural circuit dizziness is not by applying a Band-Aid, like helping yourself with the symptoms. It's by dealing with whatever emotional distress is going on beneath the surface. For some of you, it's repressed emotions like we've talked about in previous videos. For some of you, it's deep internal conflicts. For some of you, it's ongoing feelings of not being quite worthy or not really liking yourself. For some of you, it's patterns of people-pleasing and perfectionism that have caused you to put a lot of pressure on yourself. These are the things you need to focus on to get better in the long run from chronic dizziness. I will link above and in the description below to a video where I go into detail on these things. That said, you're having trouble with supermarkets now, and you're going to deal with some of these emotional issues, I hope, because that is, again, my best advice. But let's try to make you a little more comfortable while you're doing it. So understanding what we just talked about, that the eyes are just causing too much information to go in, and they're just being overwhelmed by the bombardment of visual information, plus you're also trying to coordinate walking and moving. That's all the cause of your symptoms. Let's talk about what you can do to mitigate this. So one thing you can try that we already discussed in the last video is something like somatic tracking, but you can use a track called Somatic Walking instead. So my advice would be to perhaps do this on a day when you don't have to run to the supermarket because something's really important. You're going to just practice walking down the aisles of the supermarket really slowly while you're listening to this track or while you're practicing the technique. As always, you're welcome to listen to the track once or twice, understand the technique, and then apply it on your own. Or if you prefer the guided version, you can always use the track. However, that general technique of mindful walking, paying attention to the symptoms that come up without judging them, is going to help you conquer some of this extra fear and anxiety that's coming up when you start to have symptoms at the supermarket. I also very strongly advise that you plan your supermarket shopping or grocery shopping or market shopping at a time, if possible, that is off peak, so you don't have to deal with a lot of people jostling back and forth. If you have a family that you often go with, it can be a lot easier sometimes to go alone, so you can take things at your own pace. And you can also practice something called graded exposure when it comes to supermarkets. So I talk about this in my free course. I will link to the free course below, again, 100% free. I talk about this in one of the steps on how to get moving again. I give you kind of a graded exposure plan. So graded exposure means you're slowly starting to do the things that have caused symptoms before. So you're going to do this maybe not at a peak time. You're going to expose yourself to the supermarket in a very calm time, and you're going to work your way up to longer trips and trips at times when perhaps there are more people you might be exposed to. You can also use graded motor imagery for this one. Just picturing yourself going into the supermarket and knowing that everything is going to be okay can also be really helpful here. I've also heard from some clients that it's really useful to wear sunglasses or a hat in the store to reduce the glare of the lights. Now again, I don't want you relying on these crutches in the long run, because ultimately we want your system to recalibrate and be able to handle these stimuli normally. But in the meantime, while you're still working on these emotional pieces, if you do this as a way to be kind to yourself and you say, I'm compassionately putting a hat on or putting sunglasses on so I don't have to suffer more than I have to, that is perfectly fine by me. Okay, so you get home from the supermarket and it's time perhaps to cook, clean, and do chores. And this is another major trigger for people, because just like we talked about when you get up in the morning and you're doing all this looking up and looking down and bending over and turning, that's exactly what you have to do when you're cooking. And this is yet another thing that I tell people is a perfect vestibular exercise. Do enough cooking and you don't need to do regular VRT exercises or vestibular rehabilitation exercises. So with cooking, again, I think here it is much more important to pay attention to the emotional piece. With the supermarkets, we said, it's probably not an emotional association with supermarkets. It's probably just the stuff that's happening there. I find the same is not necessarily true of cooking, because there's all sorts of emotional stuff that comes up with food. Who are you feeding? Are you feeding just yourself? Is that something that makes you happy? Are you feeding a group of people who are not helping you? Is this kind of your responsibility in the family to take care of everyone and feed everyone? These are things you should be asking yourself if cooking is a big trigger for you. Now, it may just be the movements and there's nothing special about cooking, and that's fine. We should always just be asking ourselves the question. Always look at the possible emotional components first when it comes to these things. Now, what can be really helpful with cooking is to prepare yourself for cooking, knowing that you're going to be doing a lot of movements that may be triggering, by starting to practice something like parasympathetic breathing or like the peripheral vision technique we talked about in the previous video. If you do that, it's not going to mitigate your symptoms. So it's not going to take your symptoms away, but it is going to reduce kind of that alarm response to your symptoms. Again, from my perspective, the way we make your symptoms stop is by addressing stress, emotional issues, all the stuff I've talked about a million times so far in this video. But that doesn't mean that you also have to suffer all the anxiety and the fear that makes it so much worse at the same time. So by using something like breathing or peripheral vision, it will help reduce that alarm response to the symptoms, again, that makes them worse. Now, there are two other things that might help you with cooking, and they're kind of opposite approaches, so you pick the one that you think fits you best. One approach is to think of the cooking like a really valuable vestibular exercise. So instead of, oh gosh, I'm gonna go in the kitchen and it's gonna be horrible, I have to bend and turn and I'm gonna be so dizzy, think of it like, oh, cool, I'm gonna go into the kitchen and I'm gonna stimulate my vestibular system, and it's gonna be great because now I'm gonna teach my brain it's safe. And every time my brain thinks it's not safe, I'm gonna breathe and I'm gonna remind it it's safe. It's a form of therapy. So if you look at cooking like a form of therapy, it's much less likely to trigger some of those really, really distressing symptoms. The other approach is to take kind of a softer, gentler, self-compassion based approach. When you have moments of symptoms and you start to freak out, you would put your hand on your heart and you would remind yourself, hey, I'm safe. I know this is scary. This is just my brain doing what it was designed to do to protect me from threat. It's a false alarm, but it's okay, I'm safe. And pausing and taking a few breaths and taking it slowly if you need to. So all three of those approaches are things that may help you with this cooking related triggers. Okay, so all that is done. You've done your chores, you've done your cleaning, you've done your cooking, and now it's nighttime. And some of you have a surge of symptoms in the nighttime. So I have an entire video that talks about this. So you can see that above or in the video description below, why your dizziness gets worse at nighttime. So I'm not going to revisit all the concepts there, but generally it just usually is related to accumulated stress from the day. So unlike in some of these other situations that we talked about over the last series of videos, I'm going to give you pretty structured and specific advice for how to deal with nighttime. It is essential that you use your nighttime to ramp down and get yourself a good night's sleep. Now, don't worry if insomnia is part of your symptoms. It's okay. You don't have to freak out about it. You're just going to do the best you can. But that ramp down is going to be your best bet at both managing the dizziness symptoms and getting a good night's rest. So the first thing I would really like you to consider doing is starting to dim the lights. And I know that can be very, very challenging when you have dizziness symptoms because, again, as we've talked about, your balance system may be over-relying on your eyes. But if at all possible, you want dim lighting. In my home, that lighting goes down about 2 hours before bedtime. So you'll want to turn off overhead lights at least and maybe turn on lamps or floor lights like the ones that you plug into the little sockets. A little bit of light exercise can be really helpful here because by raising your body temperature just a little bit with exercise, you'll also get a rebound dropping of the temperature of your body. And actually that cooling of your body helps prime you for sleep as well. This is also the time when I really want you to consider journaling or checking in with yourself in another way that's meaningful to you. It doesn't have to be formal meditation or journaling. Meditation can be incredibly helpful. It can be a wonderful way to wind down at the end of the day. But even if you're using meditation to do that, I would still like you to have some time to actually be introspective and feel your feelings from the day. By practicing this over and over again, you're going to develop more emotional awareness, and that is what's actually going to be your best skill when learning how to reverse these changes that have led you to have chronic dizziness symptoms. Emotional awareness is really underrated, in my opinion. So again, for most people, journaling is the best way to do this. Some people will do like a private video blog or vlog. Some people do audio journaling. All of those are options. There just should be some time for you to visit back with yourself at the end of the day, regroup, and figure out what to make of the day that you just went through. If you have nighttime dizziness, it's also a fantastic time to use all of the techniques that we talked about previously that are calming. Parasympathetic breathing, peripheral vision, if that's possible. You can also use somatic tracking or somatic walking at this point, or you can go into a full body scan. I have one of those on my brain exercises playlist as well. I'll link to it above and below. And that's a way that you can help bring your body down to a restful state after the excitement of the day. I know that many of these recommendations are very standard common sense recommendations, but the most important thing for you to know is that nighttime dizziness is definitely normal. And it doesn't mean that there's something wrong with you or that you're going to live with nighttime dizziness for the rest of your life. It just means that there are still some things you need to work on. So I want to encourage you that this, as all the other things that we talked about in this series of videos, all of these things will get better as you recover from neural circuit dizziness. So you're not stuck here forever. I hope some of these tips and tricks were helpful, guys. Comment below if you have any questions. And as always, please like, share, and subscribe if this video was helpful for you. I will talk to you guys soon, and thank you so much for tuning in. Bye.